All right. So, oops. Let's see if I can move on from this slide. I wanted to thank everybody for dialing into today's electric vehicle chalk talk. This is actually the first first of a speaker series that we are sponsoring as the Atlantic Highlands Environmental Commission. We got together a couple months ago and realized that there was a tremendous amount of opportunity for us to try to communicate more with the public and our residents, try to share information, solicit input, listen. So this is the first of hopefully many of these presentations to come. There's a couple different things that I wanted to kind of start us off with from a high level. This is going to be probably about a 30-minute presentation. There's 6 main areas that I'm going to cover off on. I'm going to talk to you about driving an EV, so what it's like to drive an EV, charging an EV, the economics of owning, buying and operating an EV, talk a bit about the environmental benefits, go into some really important details about EV ownership, and then talk to you a little bit about options. At the end of the day, the goal here is really to make sure that everybody here leaves with a good understanding of how EVs work, whether one is right for you. And I'm not here to sell an EV to anybody. It's just to help understand, what the benefits and potential, negatives of it are. And then finally, what to look for if you decide it's time to go out and buy one. Sound good? All right. And we have a relatively small group. So if anybody wants to nose in with a question or a comment at any point, feel free to interrupt me. It won't bother me one bit. Okay, so first, a couple of basics. So electric vehicles are actually surprisingly old technology. If you go back and kind of read the history on this, you can make an argument that electric vehicles have existed longer than gas vehicles. The first electric motor was invented about in the 1820s. The first gas engine or internal combustion engine was around in 1860. They didn't really end up in passenger vehicles until later in the 19th century. But it is fair to say that electric vehicles were the primary form of personal transportation from around 1890 to 1930. During that time, EVs were the predominant vehicle that you would see on the road. And they actually worked a lot like they do now back then. They were plugged into the wall to charge. They had a battery. They had an electric motor. The real beginning of the decline of the EV, the first decline of the EV, started probably around 1910 when the electric starter was invented. EVs were actually originally marketed to upscale women, was one of the primary markets. And one of the reasons why was that a gas car prior to the electric starter needed to be cranked to start. It was a very sweaty and sometimes dangerous ordeal. There were people that were dislocating shoulders and causing all kinds of injuries. So EVs, much kind of like Teslas are today, were made very luxury vehicles and marketed to women. Now, around 1930, gas engines had really taken over in the US, and EVs were kind of relegated to the dustbin of history, at least for quite a long time. And I won't get into GM's foray into EVs again in the 90s. I think that some of the more recent history is probably reasonably well known to folks up to and including where we are today. But I always thought that this is interesting in historical context to understand that EVs are not that new. And in fact, if you look at this kind of image of what a typical EV looks like, they're actually not that complicated. EVs, I think, have a reputation as being this next generation technology, and they are in many ways. But the underlying fundamentals of how an EV works has not really changed all that much. This is what a typical EV could look like. This one is a single motor kind of example where you can see that red motor in the front. There's a high voltage DC battery under the floor pan where your passengers would sit. There's a couple other components that I would draw your attention to. There's a charger, and I'll talk more about this in a little bit more detail. That charger is bringing in generally 220 volt AC input from your home or from some other charger. That 220 volt, it might sound a little strange, but if you have an electric dryer, you probably already have a 220 volt hookup in your home. That gets plugged into that charge port, and then there's a converter that actually turns it into DC electricity to charge the battery. Other notable things, you do have a thermal system in the front, similar to a radiator. In the more recent EVs, that will be what's called a heat pump. Heat pumps are another conversation that I'd love to have with anybody about effective ways to heat and cool your home. They're a truly wonderful technology. But in an EV, they're used to both air condition or heat the cabin, as well as keep the battery cool so that it can continue to operate efficiently. So a couple like important details to understand about this. EVs are rapidly growing in popularity. Consumer Reports did a survey almost 2 years ago now, where they found that 71% of drivers said they would consider buying an EV at some point. And when people buy an EV, 95% of them say that they will buy an EV again, and that's up 14% year over year in 2019, and I'm sure it's probably around that now. And what this is really telling you is that the average US consumer is becoming much more open to the idea of buying an EV, and then the people that take the plunge are going to stay. Now, the last important metric here, and this is just a good thing to keep in the back of your mind, is that 64% brand loyalty, which I believe has been relatively consistent. I heard on Marketplace maybe a couple months ago. What I think that this is telling us is that people are generally excited about EV as a technology, but they're not as excited about the first car that they get into, and they're not particularly committed. So for early entrants to the most recent kind of EV market like Tesla, this should be a very concerning statistic, and likely is. So let's talk a little bit about driving an EV. First, it drives like a car. Like if you're at all worried that driving an EV is going to be this foreign experience, it's not. Not only is it fundamentally pretty much the same as driving a car, but the manufacturers really want to make it feel like driving any old car. They don't want you to get into an EV and feel like it's strange or different. They feel fast. Even the cheaper ones feel fast. And I'm going to talk about torque in a minute, not in too much detail because I don't want to bore everybody. But when you put your foot on the proverbial gas of an EV, it. The car will get up and go very, very quickly. More expensive ones are really fast. I'll talk about this a little bit more later. But when you get up into kind of the hypercar realm, there's really no way to beat an EV from a cost per performance perspective. They're just it's unfair. It's kind of like the first time you picked up a smartphone and compared it to a flip phone. There's no real comparison there anymore. And the other thing from a driving perspective is the weight of the vehicle is carried low. What that means physically is the car feels quite planted. Like if you're out on Navesink River Road, you're not feeling the same amount of body roll if you're going a little faster than you should be. And also when you're getting into ice or other adverse conditions, the car actually feels more stable and firmly planted in those types of conditions than a typical car that's heavier, generally in the front when you have an engine in the front. And I won't get into rear and front wheel drive, but it's a nice effect of EVs. So, I run into this question sometimes, not so much anymore, because I think most people realize that EVs are just flat out fast as hell. But if you look at this kind of scientifically, you have the relationship between torque and power. Horsepower, is your red line, and torque is your blue line, which is your foot pounds. That's actually the kind of what you would call almost the starting moment of the vehicle. So if you think about when a car is either stopped or already in motion, the torque is the amount of force that's needed to move the car forward. And what you can see from these bands is basically that in an internal combustion engine, you're going to see a ramp up of torque as RPMs increase. But with an EV on the right, you can see that even when the motor isn't spinning, you're getting a tremendous amount of torque from the get-go. So when I said earlier, like you push down the gas pedal on an EV and you're flying, it's because of this kind of the nature of the electric motor having instant available torque. That's why the Model S Plaid, admittedly a $130,000 car, has a 0 to 60 time of 1.99 seconds, but even the Chevy Bolt can do it in 6.3. And that number doesn't even really tell the story. If you sit down in a Chevy Bolt and floor it, it's going to feel like a BMW for the first 20 or 30 miles. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about range. Range is probably one of the most common, concern areas that people have about EVs. And when you haven't driven an EV, it's very easy to become preoccupied with this idea of like, oh my gosh, if I have 200 miles of range, or 300 miles of range, what does that mean? Is this going to be a problem? And I'm going to talk more about that later, and I'm going to try to convince you it's not really as big of a problem as it seems. And I took the plunge 3 or 4 years ago. I can tell you, I was very fixated on range before I bought an EV, and I don't think about it anymore after I bought it. And I'll try to explain in more detail about why that's the case. But for now, I just wanted to say EVs generally, it's hard to find one with less range than 200 miles. Some cars are up to 400 at this point, and there's ones that will probably crack 500 in the next year or two. So this is becoming increasingly a non-factor. Paired with the fact that charging speeds are increasing, EVs are in pretty good shape in this category. A couple of really important details, though. Batteries are rated in what's called kilowatt hours. Generally speaking, most vehicles will have, somewhere between 60 to 100 kilowatt hours. Some have a little bit less, and some in the future are likely to have more. One of the things that is important to understand about what goes into that range is what's called efficiency. So it's measured in what's called watt hours per mile. And when you sit in an EV, there will actually be a little gauge that tells you what your current efficiency is, anywhere from like 200 watt hours per mile up to 300. And if you take your, battery size in kilowatt hours and you divide it by the efficiency, that's how you get your range. Now, most vehicles, generally speaking, are going to be in that 250 to 260 realm. There are some very effective, what you would call hypermilers, or people that are really good at driving a vehicle very efficiently that can get down to 200 watt hours per mile. But the average person is probably going to be around 250 to 300 in most cars. Now, there are other impacts to mileage that you should be aware of. Heating and air conditioning use charge in an EV. Believe it or not, they also use fuel in a car, but it's probably a little bit more pronounced in an EV. Your driving style matters a lot. If you're a lead foot, you're going to get, less range. If you're, braking suddenly, you're going to get less range. And I'll talk a little bit about regenerative braking in a while. But I don't want to give anybody a scare around this stuff. The truth is, these cars are quite forgiving, and as long as you drive it normally, you will get kind of the expected results. And it's not something you have to think about very much. So regenerative braking, if anybody has driven a hybrid before, I think many of you probably have, you're aware that when you're either braking or coasting in a hybrid, you're recharging your battery. In an EV, it's actually more pronounced. And in fact, most of the time when you're driving an EV, you're doing what's called one pedal driving, which is you are accelerating with the gas pedal. And then when you let off the gas pedal, you will feel the car brake naturally. It's not like, shifting down into second gear on a hill and finding the car lurch, but it will slow down gradually. And if you're doing that effectively, in other words, if your foot's not on the brake very much, you're going to get some of the best efficiency out of the car because you're slowly accelerating and then slowly decelerating as you approach, say, lights or stop signs. One of the nice things about this is, since you're not braking in an EV very often, brake pads are one of the things that you will either very infrequently or most likely never have to replace. I'm going to talk more about this later when it comes to total cost of ownership. But at the end of the day, the fact that you don't have to replace things like brake pads has to be really, and many, many other things, has to be carefully considered when you're thinking about what the cost to operate an EV is. So let's talk about charging. This has the risk of being one of the most boring sections, so I'm going to try to go relatively quickly, not to set it up in a bad way. There's 3 levels of charging that that are kind of universally agreed upon. Level 1 is just a standard 120 volt outlet. Every EV that you buy will come with a generally 120 volt kit, which is like a little mobile connector kit that sits in the trunk. You can run a wire out to a plug. You'll get, between 3 to 4 miles an hour of charge, which usually takes 6 to 22 hours to get to full charge. I'm going to try to convince all of you that for many of us, 110 is level one is actually adequate. There's a lot of people that I know who will charge at 110 during the week and then go to a charger during the weekends, because if they have a 300-mile range, they'll be slowly depleting but have enough. And then they'll, when they go shopping, they'll charge up or something like that. If you're thinking about the expense of setting up one of these level two chargers, don't automatically assume it's necessary. And I'll touch on that again later. Level two is when you're getting up to that 208 volt to 240 volt, like a dryer connection. You may actually, depending on your home's configuration, have an easy way to set up a level two charger, because if you have a dryer connection, for instance, in your garage where the dryer is, you can actually plug in a little smart switch that will run the dryer and then charge the EV when the dryer is not in operation. So you can do that very cheaply without engaging an electrician. If you don't have that, trenching a line or running a line that can carry, 40 amps or 32 amps or whatever in order to meet the charging requirements might cost a little bit of money. But when you sit down and think about the overall cost of ownership, it might make sense, especially if you're planning to drive EVs for the foreseeable future, which hopefully most people here are at least open to that idea. Level three fast charging is what you're really going to use for road trips. When it says commercial use, it doesn't mean that normal people can't use them. I don't know why they put that there, but these fast chargers are generally somewhere between 400 to 500 volts. In fact, there are cars now coming out that have an 800 volt architecture, which is pretty cool. And what that means is that you're plugging into a charger that's at the same voltage as the battery, and it's completely bypassing the onboard charger to charge the battery that's in the vehicle. And that means that you can get 40 minutes to full charge might be conservative. If you're doing a road trip and you're at 20%, you might be able to get to 80% in 15, 20, 25 minutes, about as long as it takes to get a coffee and go to the bathroom. And one of the things about driving an EV on road trips that's nice is, in fact, I've grown to appreciate it, is like taking a break every couple hours of driving is generally pretty good for you. And it works pretty well if you've planned things out so that you can use a DC fast charge. Okay, this slide looks scary as hell. I apologize. I'm going to try to make it a little less scary. There are a whole bunch of different connectors that EVs use throughout the world. The truth is, there's really only a couple that you're going to encounter in practice, and it's becoming kind of simpler day to day. The J1772 in the top left corner is becoming the industry standard level 2 charger in the US. In fact, I would argue it already is. Like you really can't find a non 1772 charger in the US. The EU has the Menikeys, but I think that they're transitioning primarily over to CCS, which I won't. If you kind of stare at the CCS, you can see that it's actually just the J1772 charger with a DC charger on the bottom. I'm going to try to demystify this a little bit. So as I mentioned previously on this slide, the level 1 and the level 2 are your AC based charging systems. The level 3 is the DC based charging system. So when I say that the AC charger for J1772 looks like the CCS one, the reason why is because a lot of vehicles now are shipping with a CCS charger, but you can plug the J1772 into it for AC charging or the CCS in for DC fast charging. And that's becoming kind of the worldwide standard. The only other ones that I would attract your attention to, CHAdeMO is Nissan and a couple other companies have been trying to make CHAdeMO happen. There are a bunch of them in the country, but I don't think it's ultimately going to be that successful. I think it will be phased out in favor of the CCS standard. And the only other one is the Tesla one. Now, Tesla is a little bit tricky because it is only available to Tesla vehicles. You can't adapt other vehicles to it, at least for now, though, and I'll put a big asterisk on that. There are Elon Musk, who's the CEO of Tesla, has been indicating for a while that he has openness to actually offering his supercharger network to other vehicles. And they've in fact been licensing it to VW kind of on the sly in certain countries. So it would not surprise me if the Tesla charger became available. All of these, by the way, can be adapted to each other. Like, one of the things about this that might seem scary and it's not, is that if you pull up to a charger, for the most part, if it's not compatible with the car as is, there's probably a little connector in your trunk that will let you adapt it so that you can plug in. So I wanted to highlight a couple local places to charge in Asbury Park on, oh gosh, not Madison, maybe it was Madison Avenue. I can't remember. There's two chargers, no, four charge. There's two chargers, four plugs, and four spots. So if you like going to Asbury Park and you want to always have parking, get an EV because pretty much you'll always get a spot for the most part. During the summer, sometimes there's four cars there, but a lot of times it's not. There's four spots in Red Bank, two in front of the Count Basie and two in the White Street lot. Those are occupied sometimes. The Cinemark in Hazlitt has two spots. They're actually free. They're over near the theater, but you can park there and go to the Costco. They're often occupied. Bellworks has some. Jersey Shore Premium Outlets has a bunch, like a ton. They have Tesla chargers. They have EVgo, a bunch of others. There's a bunch of car dealerships in the area. If you want to get some funny looks, go park at one of the car dealerships and plug your car in. Sometimes they'll give you static, but not always. And then hopefully Atlantic Highlands someday soon. We don't have a public charger really within about 8 or 9 miles. Red Bank is probably the closest one. So, hopefully someday soon we'll have one here in town. There's another detail here that I'll just cover off on really quickly. It's called time of use charging. There's a way that you can work with JCP&L to set up what's called peak time of use metering, which is when you're using electricity between 9 p.m. and 9 a.m. You'll be charged at a significantly lower rate. This is probably not worth it here because the rate structure just doesn't, it's not a big enough difference that unless you could get a meter that's specifically dedicated to EV charging, it's going to be hard to save money this way. But if you do have a separate meter and you can get time of use set up for it, it could be a really good way to save money. But I can tell you that a lot of folks have experience trying to get GCP&L to install one of these, and it's a hassle. So I wouldn't make a buying decision based on the assumption that you could get this set up. But if you have the time and inclination to pursue it, it can be potentially really useful. So I heard EV charging slow. This is like one of the concerns that folks bring up a lot. They'll say, oh, if I do a 10-hour road trip and I'm going to have to charge 2 times, am I going to be spending a bunch of time charging? And that's true. If I got up in front of you and said, your road trips are going to be just as fast as a gas car, I'd be lying. The truth is, if you're taking a 2-hour road trip, you probably need to plan for 1.5 to 2 hours of charging in the middle. And if you're planning it out right, I'd argue that you should be getting lunch or stretching your legs or seeing some sights somewhere rather than just driving straight through. But I want to be open and transparent about that. The charging is not immediate. But in terms of your day-to-day, one of the things that is most different about driving an EV is that you just don't think about charging or filling up much at all. Like if you are plugging in at home at night, you are waking up every day with a full tank of gas. And if you're waking up every day with a full tank of gas, you really don't need to stop very often. I can't remember the last time I was at a gas station. I mean, I was at a gas station to fill the air in my tires, but I can't remember the last time I had to fill up a tank. And we do have another car, but I'm not the primary driver on that one. Okay, trip planning. So if you are going on a road trip, you can definitely, there are ways to plan out where you're going to charge. Your car definitely will direct you to EV charging stations. There isn't a modern EV on the market beside maybe the older Nissan Leafs, like the 2013 to 2015, maybe, that don't have this capability. There's older ones than that. But if you're buying like a 2015 or forward car, you're almost certainly going to have nav, and that nav will almost certainly tell you when you were trying to go somewhere that exceeds your charge, and it will direct you to a charging station. In fact, in my car, when I'm driving, if it thinks that I'm getting out of range of an EV, of a charging station, it will say something to me like, hey, you should reduce your speed to 65 from 80, which I shouldn't be driving 80, admittedly. But it'll say you should reduce your speed because if you keep going as fast as you're going, you may not make it to the next charging station. So the car will work like hell to prevent you from getting into trouble with your charge. And I don't want to sound mean, but you kind of have to be a little dumb to run yourself out of charge if you're using the car systems correctly. And I don't want to be overly pejorative, but I really feel that way. The car is quite good at this. So let's move on to, and hopefully no one here drives an EV and managed to run their car into charge because, we still got 10 people on, so I haven't offended anybody yet too much. Let's talk about economics. So first, incentives. There are different incentives that are available to buying electric vehicles that you should be aware of. The first one, the one that made the most news last year, was the New Jersey plug-in New Jersey program. I can't remember what it's called. They were offering a $5,000 incentive for any vehicle under $55,000 last year. The program was so successful that it had to shut down after like 3 or 4 months. They ran out of money. A bunch of people bought EVs that are still waiting on their rebates. And it's not completely clear whether or not this will be in the budget this year. I think some of the most recent reads have suggested that it is not yet included in the budget as of right now. That could change, but it's worth being aware that that thing is out there and could happen. What I would tell anybody here is if you're at all thinking about buying an EV and that incentive becomes available, you should act quickly. That's a lot of money for a new car to be able to get on top of other potential incentives. And also it will go quickly. So you have to be ready to act. There are federal incentives. I'm going to talk more about these later, but there is a $7,500 incentive for EVs below a certain sales threshold. What does sales threshold mean? It means that the manufacturer has sold fewer than, I think, 250,000 of that car. That's why it's exhausted for Tesla's Model 3, Model S, Model Y, Model S. You can no longer get this incentive for those cars anymore. There's also other incentives that are potentially on the docket, including a $2,500 Built in America incentive and a $2,500 Built with Union Labor incentive. I wouldn't hold your breath that these pass, but maybe they will. I think everybody understands how politics work these days and how difficult some of these things can be to get done, but there are proposals for that. The other thing that is worth being aware of is JCP&L does occasionally offer incentives on the Nissan Leaf. I don't know why that particular vehicle, but they do, and they've done it, various times over the years. And then Costco is currently offering rebates on the Chevy Bolt and the Volvo XC40 Recharge. The Recharge, this Volvo, in my humble opinion, it does not get enough attention. It is a really nice looking vehicle, a little pricey, but with the incentives, I think it should be garnering more looks if you can find one. They are a little bit on the hard side to find, hard side to find, as are many cars. I think everybody knows that buying cars right now is not the easiest it's ever been. One other incentive that isn't here that I neglected to mention, but is so super important, is in the great state of New Jersey, there is no tax on electric EV purchases. So you go buy, you're not paying the 6 3/4 or whatever it is when you buy an EV. That is all free and clear. Whoever you buy from, if you buy privately, there's a form that you can print out to take to the DMV, indicating that you don't have to pay any sales tax. Alternatively, most dealers will give you that form. And one other nice benefit that I forgot to list in this presentation is EVs are also not inspected in the state of New Jersey. So you don't get an inspection sticker. You don't have to deal with that anymore, which is just really, really darn nice. Okay, so this is the quick crosstab on the cost to operate an EV versus a gas vehicle. I tried to do some quick and realistic math. On the left, you can see for an EV, you got 15.8 cents per kilowatt hour, which is the standard rate here for JCP&L. If you get 260 watt hours per mile and an 80 kilowatt battery, you're looking at $12.64 to fill up for a 308 mile range. That comes out to about 4 cents a mile, which is the equivalent of approximately $1.20 per gallon of gas. For an ICE car, assuming you get 30 miles per gallon in a 12-gallon tank, you're talking about 36 to fill it up and 10 cents per mile. And then from a maintenance perspective, I mentioned this earlier, you got no brake pads, no oil changes. Tires are pretty much the same, but no timing belts. I mean, you go look at an exploded view, like a maintenance diagram of one of these EVs, you'll be shocked at how little stuff is inside the car. And when there's not that much inside the car, there's not much stuff to break, which means that you might be paying a little bit more upfront for the car, but you have a high degree of certainty that your overall cost of ownership as it relates to maintenance will be much, much, much lower than a gas car. And you can take that to the bank.
Hey, Blake.
Yes.
Can I ask a question? This is Sarah Colasurdo.
Yes. Hi, Sarah.
With regards to maintenance and costs, I've been thinking about the EV hybrids, and it seems like the best of both worlds in a way, in case I am one of those silly people who forgets to recharge or something. But then also maybe the worst of both worlds if it has the maintenance of both, like like it still does it still have I suppose it still has all the maintenance of an internal combustion engine, right?
Yeah, but I would PHEVs are, in my opinion, are a great option, and I think the most instructive example to look at would be something like the Prius. If you look at the service history of a Prius and the cost to own a Prius and maintain it, admittedly that's not a plug-in, but it has everything in a plug-in car. A Prius has everything that's in a plug-in car, with the exception of the charging system. That's really the only thing that's added. So you can look at that and feel confident that the TCO will be consistent with something like a Prius. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's helpful.
Now,
Thank
what
you.
what I would be thinking about is, the Prius is like the gold standard. Like that thing runs forever, costs very little, costs very little, period. If you were looking, there's newer PHEVs. I would just be looking at the service record of that vehicle in general and just making sure that, it's and you can even, one of the most useful things you can do is look at, is that PHEV based on a platform that is just a gas car? Because that will give you a lot of indication about the overall reliability of that vehicle before they made it a PHEV. And that can be a really useful thing to think about. So anyway, I think PHEVs are awesome. And I have a lot of opinions about those, which I could spend more time talking about at the end.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. So generally speaking, EVs, what's the wrap on EVs? They're really expensive and they don't pay off. That's usually, somebody who's a skeptic will say that to me. And the truth is, if you go out and buy yourself a Tesla Model X, like, you're not going to save money over buying a Honda Odyssey. Like, I apologize, that's just not how it works. But if you think about like truly like apples to apples comparisons, like looking at, a Chevy Bolt versus I don't know, a Ford, Fiesta or a Honda Fit or something like that, that's when you start to get into the realm of, with the federal incentives, the 5-year TCO of an EV starts to get pretty equivalent to a gas car. Now, one important thing to understand about this, and it's crucial to understanding why EVs are truly inevitable, just like they're coming, and someday soon you'll be considered silly to drive a gas car, is that the cost per kilowatt hour of a battery 10 years ago was $1,000. Now it's $100. So it's gone down 90%. When it gets to about $60 to $70 per kilowatt hour, that's when you're getting to the point where an EV will be the same as a gas car without any incentives at all. And there's absolutely no reason to believe that the cost per kilowatt hour will not go significantly below 60, at which point you're talking about a car that's just cheaper to buy, cheaper to operate, cheaper to maintain, performs better. It's going to be categorically better. And it might not happen overnight, but that's what's kind of on the horizon.
Hey, Blake.
Yes.
So what is the average lifespan of an EV compared to an internal combustion vehicle?
Great question. So there's a couple of different ways to think about it. In terms of your own personal ownership, the car itself, separate and apart from the drivetrain and everything, like, does the interior wear, or I'm going to try to answer your question in the most simple way possible, Brian, which is, you should expect it to last the same amount of time as a gas car or longer in terms of the actual functioning of the vehicle in its ability to take a charge, drive, be safe, all that stuff. It's as good or better. Now, in terms of like the practical reality of it, we in America change cars too quickly. It's like, one of the horrible things that we do to the environment is we don't stay in cars long enough. We sell them. And that could be because you fall out of love with the features, or the interior gets dirtier than you like, or any number of reasons. And practically speaking, an EV is not going to be any different from a gas car in that regard. Like, if you get tired of a car and sell it, you'll get tired of an EV and sell it for kind of the same reasons as a gas car, in my opinion. Now, if you're asking the question from an overall kind of life cycle sustainability perspective, that's a much, much more interesting conversation, in my opinion, because the EV flat out kicks the tail of a gas car. And the reason why is because the motor itself, the motor or motors themselves will last for probably 10 times as long as a gas car in terms of their ability to just function, for a while. The suspension of the car is the same, all that other stuff is the same, but the engine itself will last a long time. But the battery is actually the really interesting thing, which is the battery, all the rare earths that go into producing an EV battery, when the battery is is no longer able to hold charge and can't be in service anymore, everything that was in the battery when it was created is still essentially there. And that really matters from a sustainability perspective, because increasingly there are companies that believe, and I firmly believe too, and there are companies like Tesla that are already doing this, where those materials can be harvested economically and then put into new batteries in the future. And we will get to a point someday where it's no longer necessary to continue mining out, stuff to make batteries, at least not to the same degree that we are right now. So it's sorry to give a long-winded answer, but there's like a couple different ways to think about the problem. Did that help?
Absolutely. No, I was particularly thinking about the battery life. Anyone who owns an iPhone knows that eventually those lithium-ion batteries start to lose their ability to hold a charge. So yeah, so excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And let me tackle that question head on. So if you buy a car from any manufacturer that's selling an EV, they are generally going to warrant that the car will maintain 70% of its range for up to 10 years. Now, the truth is that different vehicles perform differently. The older Nissan Leafs, I hate to say it, were notorious because they had an air-cooled rather than a liquid-cooled battery for suffering premature failure and getting to a point. I mean, you could buy EVs on eBay right now that can only drive like 20 miles before they stop, because they've literally lost so much range, and it's horrible. Now, I don't like to hold up Tesla, even though I think that they are exceptional in many ways, but it's common to there's a taxi service that actually drives from LA to Vegas. They've got 4 Teslas and they do the trip however many times a day, and they have over 1 million miles on a couple of those cars, and they still have 85 to 90% of their charge available. Also, in the event that the battery fails prematurely, these companies all warranty them and will replace them, and it's actually like a 4-hour job for them. It's not that big a deal. And finally, even if you couldn't get it warranted, you can do that yourself. Like if you love a car, I mean, not yourself, these things weigh thousands of pounds, but you can go to a shop and have them put a new battery in, and that's another option as well.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so let's talk about environmental benefits. So first, let's think about 2019 carbon emissions by type. So over on the left, you can see, 80% of carbon emissions in the US are carbon dioxide, methane is 10%, blah, 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 blah. One big takeaway that I want everyone here to just be aware of is that methane at 10%, it may seem like a small overall amount of the pie, which it is, but the truth is, pound for pound, methane is 86 times as impactful to climate change as carbon dioxide. Now, there's good news and bad news to that. The bad news is it's 86 times as impactful. The good news is that methane lasts much less time in the atmosphere. So like fixing methane emissions is actually a really highly value-added activity, because it can be really high impact. And methane is not just cows farting, though that's a piece of it. It's things like the process of actually extracting oil generates methane as a byproduct that just escapes into the atmosphere, which, by the way, could be captured if we decided to marginally invest in doing that, but we haven't. And other things like stuff just like degrading in landfills. So methane is really bad stuff, and that does come out of vehicles, especially diesels that have ineffective catalytic SCR systems. I can't remember the exact acronym it is. Now, if you go over and look on the right, you can look at the sources of emissions, 29% from transportation and 28% from electric power. Now, usually, and I know I don't have what seem to be any skeptics on the call here, maybe I do. But if I do have a skeptic, they'll usually say, but wait, Blake, if 29% is transportation and 28% is electric power, aren't we just going to increase the electric power piece and make the transportation piece smaller? Very fair, seemingly intellectually honest question, but the truth is if everybody in the country drove an EV, it would only require 25% more electricity than we produce now. So if you have somebody that says, where's the electricity going to come from, or that's going to strain the grid too much, they don't know what they're talking about. They're just saying something that they heard somewhere. And the truth is, we can easily generate 25% more electricity. We're on track to do it because renewable energy is becoming so cheap. It's like, it's crazy to not, be opening solar farms and wind farms. It just makes sense from a dollars and cents perspective. And the net effect of that would be a dramatic reduction in transportation emissions and a small increase in electric power emissions, if you assume that the portfolio stays the same, which, as we know, it wouldn't, because net new energy in this country is primarily going to be on renewables. I know if there's any coworkers on the phone here, I hate to be the one to kind of bear this bad news, but it's not an economical business to be in anymore. Okay, moving on to the next thing. So wait, are EVs really better for the environment? Maybe I have one last skeptic on the phone here. Let's kind of play the tape here. If you're in the US and you're in a state like West Virginia, which gets 89% of its power from coal, it's only marginally better to drive an EV than a gas car. And actually, interestingly, a hybrid is more carbon friendly than an EV in West Virginia. But if you're in the vast majority of other states that have a varying portfolio, or if you're in one of the truly superlative, amazing places, as we all know, like New Jersey, where we have a significant amount of electricity coming from things like natural gas and nuclear, it's way, way, way better. On the right, you can see the annual emissions per vehicle. You can see gasoline on the far right, up above 10,000 pounds of CO2 equivalent. And on the left, you can see EV somewhere hanging around about 2.5. And then if you look at the national averages, EVs are better pretty much everywhere. I mean, they're better everywhere, but they're pretty much significantly better almost anywhere. Now, interestingly, folks often raise the point of, hey, New Jersey, 50% of our portfolio is natural gas. It is true that natural gas is a fossil fuel, and ideally over time we would be reducing our usage of it. But in terms of the carbon emissions associated with natural gas generation of electricity, I don't know the numbers, but it's way the heck less than something like coal or other. One other thing that's just worth keeping in mind is, just to be fully intellectually honest about this, EVs do require a little bit more carbon to produce. I didn't account for it in the analysis just because it wouldn't be easy to do kind of an apples for apples. It doesn't really move the needle, from an overall conclusion perspective, but you should be aware that EVs do require more carbon, especially in the production of the battery. MIT actually sponsored a project, and you can find it at Carbon Counter, which actually shows the carbon dioxide emissions per mile and the cost to operate. And it shows in that gray color gas cars, and the green color diesel cars, and the red color hybrids and PHEVs, and then yellow and EVs. You can see things like the Nissan Leaf, which are way down there in terms of cost and way down there in emissions. If I sounded earlier like I was slagging the Nissan Leaf, I'm not. It is actually, the newer ones have significantly more reliable batteries. I would tell anybody that a Nissan Leaf is a great vehicle to buy. I would just say that if you were thinking about a used one, I would be cautious about making sure that you're buying one with a healthy battery. Is this stuff making sense? All right, good stuff. So a couple other things. This is a handy dandy little chart from, I think it was from the American Lung Association, that showed the air quality of New Jersey in March 2019. These were NO2 levels, and then March of 2020, after the pandemic had started to settle in. So these are kind of the stakes just in terms of our air quality. It doesn't have to go back to the old way as the economy reopens. And unfortunately, for a while, I think it will. But, we can see from the data, and we can see this, if we somewhere down the road go look at kind of premature deaths, we'll see these numbers too reflected in the long run. I'm certain that this, kind of temporary pause in emissions had a really marked effect on our air quality. So let's talk about the cost of doing nothing. I talked about it a little bit. I'm not going to dwell on this too much because I wasn't really here to, beat anybody up about any of this stuff. But, there's a whole bunch of negative health impacts that come from both, poor air quality as well as, uncontrolled climate change. I personally am very concerned about people living in southern states that may find that they can no longer even live some of these places, especially people like farmers. You know, they're in Central America, there's starting to be these horrible reports of renal failure amongst farmers who are becoming horribly dehydrated because of heat. I think that there's more stuff like this on the horizon that we just have to take really seriously. And driving an EV, while it doesn't exactly make you an angel, it puts you a little bit more on the solution side of the equation than the problem side. Obviously, everybody remembers Sandy. You know, I won't opine too much here, but I tend to wonder if climate change ruined many boat owners' days in town. You know, lastly, I just wanted to say, if you're not ready to buy an EV, you know, keeping any old car in good condition and driving it longer than average is a really good thing you can do for the environment. You know, producing a car is a carbon intensive process. And, you know, as long as it's not a gas guzzler or an old diesel or something, like, you know, you should feel proud of keeping an old car for a long time. When the time comes to replace it, I hope you replace it with an EV, but don't feel like, you know, the only thing that you can do is go out and buy an EV today if you care about the environment, because the truth is there's other ways to contribute. So a couple of details. I talked about this already, so I'm not going to dwell. But in terms of setting up a home charger, wow, I didn't time this well. I apologize. We're over where I thought we'd be. Not everyone needs a level 2 charger. If you do need a level 2 charger, think about that electric dryer and think about whether there's an opportunity to split. If you have to run a line, you could be talking about, you know, $500, $1,000, $1,200, whatever, depending on how far the run is. So that has to be accounted for. From a safety perspective, this is important. You know, gas vehicles, about 150 of them burn a day. EVs are about a tenth as likely to burn, but they're much more likely to make the news. Everybody loses their minds when EVs burn, as if it's a reflection that EVs are somehow dangerous. One important thing is that battery fires are kind of funny. Even when you put them out, the battery can reignite due to thermal runaway. So, you know, fire departments actually have to train on keeping cold water, potentially, I think it's like 8,000 gallons is the recommendation, on an EV battery, and then monitoring it for 45 minutes before releasing it to second responders because of the risk of reignition. In terms of adverse conditions, I already talked about this, but they're good rain and snow cars. Crash safety wise, you know, EVs have extremely, you know, good NHTSA ratings. You know, the B pillars in these cars are very, very high strength. They're, you know, they don't roll very often because they're, you know, they're quite heavy and it's just hard for that to happen. But I would argue if you go YouTube for, you know, an EV's crash rate, you know, crash performance, you're going to see pretty good stuff. They have a pretty low probability of injury. And then from a rescue operations perspective, you know, this is a concern that I had, bluntly. You know, I was worried about the idea of getting into an accident and then a first responder not really knowing how to deal with it, and that made me anxious. But the truth is, I watched a bunch of YouTube videos about this, and EVs are pretty much the same as hybrid vehicles. They have the same types of high voltage lines. They have physical disconnects on the high voltage batteries that generally are disconnected in a collision. The first responders, for the most part, actually, I shouldn't say for the most part, I'm highly confident in the first responders around here and probably nationwide. They know how to go in and cut high voltage lines and keep themselves safe. And the truth is, these cars are not engineered to be dangerous. Like, the actual high voltage components are sequestered away and they're generally put in places that are not likely to be involved in an accident. So you're not going to like suddenly have a high voltage line sticking out when you get into an accident. With a couple of small exceptions, which I would talk about over beer more than I would talk about here. But you should feel safe. I talked about this already. There's no free lunch. You know, it doesn't make you an angel to buy an EV. There's strip mining for cobalt, lithium, neodymium. It's not great for the environment. There's uranium mining that supports clean energy from things like nuclear, but a lot of times uranium mining happens in places where people can't fight back against the companies that are strip mining. So that has environmental justice issues. If anybody's like kind of walking around with a halo because they're driving an EV, I think they're misguided. It's just a step in the right direction. But the reason that I tell people that you should feel good about buying an EV is not because right now you're a perfect angel and everything about it is wonderful. It's that buying an EV is paving the way for these technologies and their supply chains to continue to clean up and eventually be so much better for both the environment and people than what the current status quo, that it's permissible to tolerate a little bit of the kind of the pain in the short run. So this is our last section. I'm going to run really quickly through this. Let's talk about options. The three main kind of entry-level-ish vehicles that people think about new are the Model 3, the Nissan Leaf, and the Chevy Bolt. The Model 3, I'm sure everybody sees these all over the roads. They become extremely popular. They've got a pretty significant range. The thing about Teslas that I would just highlight for everyone to be conscientious buyers about is they do have an extremely well built out supercharger network, which for now is proprietary to Tesla. There's 25,000 of them in the world, and you can go pretty much anywhere within the continental US and be confident that you're going to, always have a supercharger backing you up, which is not always the case with all the EVs right now, though I think that that's going to change quick. The Nissan Leaf is next up. That starts at 32K. Most trims have a 226 mile range. It is eligible for federal tax credits. Sometimes there's that JCP&L credit. Before I bought my Tesla, I actually negotiated a brand new Nissan Leaf to like 18.3. So there are ways to get the number down with all the different incentives. So I would definitely be cognizant of that option. And then the Chevy Bolt is a real popular one. It was the Motor Trend Car of the Year in 2017. It may be eligible for tax credit. I won't get into why right now. It's kind of not completely eligible. Your mileage may vary. I think if you're interested, go talk to a dealer and see what they say. They might tell you that, wait a month because something's going to happen and it'll now be eligible again. But that's what's going on there. And that gets me to the most exciting one, in my opinion. There's many EVs that are out there, but the one that I think is really going to change the game is the F-150 Lightning. This is America's most popular vehicle for the past 44 years. This thing does everything. It's got about between a 230 and a 300 mile range, and MSRPs for somewhere between 40 to 60, depending on the trim and the options you get. It's eligible for the $7,500 incentive. It can power your home for multiple days in the event of a power outage. So the actual charging piece for your house is it can be reversed so that the car can feed electricity into the home. It can power your home for days. It's got a huge weather sealed front trunk that you can actually fill with ice and go front gating with. I don't even know what to call it. The thing has plugs and charging ports everywhere, 563 horsepower. It can tow 10,000 pounds. And it's just a beast. So I put my pre-order down on this because I am super excited. This car looks awesome. Here's a quick chart of all the different EVs that are available. There are a ton of really good ones out there. The Mach-E is really exciting. I drove one the other day. The Kona Electric is awesome if you can find one, but it's been sold the hell out everywhere. The Cooper SE, the Mini Cooper SE, it's actually one of the cheapest EVs that you can get into. If you remember that chart I showed, which was the CO2 per mile versus the cost per mile, the Mini Cooper SE was actually the cheapest to operate per mile, and it's partly because of that low entry point cost. It's super cool if you can find one. Somebody in town bought a Porsche Taycan. I left a note asking if I could drive it. They haven't responded yet, unsurprisingly. And then you have all those Teslas, and then the Volkswagen ID4 is out. The Volvo XC40 is out. There's lots coming. The Audi e-trons, there's a ton. I mean, this list is going to be 5 times as long within 2 years for sure. So I'm not sure if anyone caught Will Ferrell's ad during the Super Bowl, the No Way Norway ad, where he learns that Norway is buying and driving more EVs per capita than the US. He gets all mad and flies over there with Aquafina and what's his face from SNL. I cannot remember his name, but anyway, GM made a pretty bold statement at the Super Bowl. They said, we're going to have 25 EVs by 2025. Who knows, maybe by 2025, I'll be driving an electric Escalade if I'm lucky. The EV charging infrastructure is continuing to be built out. So that's really exciting. In my opinion, this is not really a blocker to owning an EV right now, but it could be better. So, I think one of the things that I would just draw everyone's attention to when we get to the keys to the game is, like I said, don't overlook L1 charging. Do some research on the charging network and build out plans. Download a trip planning app. One of the best things you can do to convince yourself that you're ready for an EV is to download a EV trip planning app, of which there's a few, and you can download their best reviewed one. And try to plot out a trip that you take often. and see what it tells you in terms of when you need to stop, where you need to stop, how long you need to charge. That will help you build confidence that this is the right move. Think about the vehicles that you might be interested in, and look at the incentives. You know, if you think that there's a car that you might like, but you want to wait for an incentive, like, be Audible ready or be game day ready. You know, have your plan so that if you find out tomorrow that the New Jersey incentive is now available, you're just getting in your car and you're going to buy a car. Like, you're not thinking about, is this the right time? Because if you are not ready for that, then by the time you're ready to go, the incentives might be gone. And then, like I said, really take care to think about the total cost of ownership. When I talk to people and I ask them, what do you think you pay to maintain your gas car? They usually have, I mean, they can point to like expensive repairs they've done, but they really don't know what it costs year over year. And that is one of the things that actually is one of the biggest mistakes you can make in terms of determining that EVs are not economical. I mean, I showed you the numbers before. These are, you know, it's not a small amount of money for some of these cars, but at the end of the day, if you're accounting for $600, $700, $800 of yearly maintenance or you know, service costs, that can make up the difference relatively quickly, especially when you consider that you're spending dramatically less on fuel. That's it. I'd recommend, if you guys want to have a little fun, go to the website normalnow.com. It has a bunch of funny ads. Like, it says, you know, hey, remember when email was weird? And it's got these kind of, turn of the century, pieces about people talking about how weird the internet is. It's a good kind of perspective to have when you're thinking about EVs, of like, oh yeah, like this is going to become the thing that everybody does. The only question is, am I kind of ahead of the curve, in the middle of the curve, or behind the curve? That's the only question, not whether it's going to happen. It's definitely going to happen. I have that's all I have, everybody. And I have a couple hands up, so I'm excited to answer questions, and I will stay as long as you guys want. Linda, why don't you go first?
Yes, thanks. This is a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. My question is about the gas tax. In New Jersey, you know, we use our gas tax to pay for infrastructure and so on. And I've heard, you know, ideas about how electric vehicles aren't going to be paying that gas tax. So do you think that they'll increase, say, your annual registration fee or something like that, make it different?
Yeah.
Fees? Is that logical?
Absolutely. Yeah, that will almost certainly happen. And hopefully New Jersey will take a forward-looking viewpoint. Like, New Jersey is taking a very forward-looking viewpoint about it right now, which is that they're not charging at all because they want to try to drive EV adoption. It's part of the reason why there's no sales tax as well. I hope that they will continue to not. I hope they don't put the cart before the horse, like, and start charging too much too soon. You can go look at a state like Texas. Texas doesn't want you to drive an EV. The amount that they are charging you for registration as a surtax, because they're not getting gas tax, is crazy. People are doing it anyway because a lot of these EVs are high performing cars and people will just buy them because they think they're cool. But yeah, Linda, I think it's a foregone conclusion that they eventually will. I don't know that it's on the horizon, but if I had to make a guess, I would say within about 3 years they will probably start to do something like that.
Thank you.
Morgan?
Hi, thank you so much. This was incredibly informative. And knowing that you wouldn't have to get your car inspected is definitely making me seriously consider it for the future. I just had a quick question, since you've been driving one for so long. In your experience, have you ever seen a charging station that's maybe powered by its own like solar panel?
There are a few companies that are doing that, though I got to be transparent. It's mostly as publicity. It's not, there's no reason it couldn't be that way, though. Okay, so I'm going to try to answer the question in a slightly more interesting way. So there's an interesting benefit to charging a car with a solar panel, which is a solar array at your house. Like here, I have solar. It is running between 380 and 450 volts at maximum capacity. That is conveniently the exact same voltage architecture of many EVs. So you could actually, at some point in the future, have fast chargers which are entirely based on solar, And like that's a benefit that is actually really exciting, because stepping up your home's voltage to 400 volts and being able to push 50, 60, 70, 80 kilowatts into a battery per hour and charge it in 20 or 30 minutes, that's extremely difficult to do on a home grid without solar. But with solar, either at your home or in a commercial setting, you potentially could. Now, why are companies not doing that yet? I have a feeling that because people are not accustomed to paying for charging completely yet, like a lot of us, it's easy to get spoiled and go places and charge like even below the normal going rate to charge your car. And I think the consumer may not yet be ready to pay, for instance, 50 cents a kilowatt hour or whatever it end up being, to actually subsidize the solar, the transformers, and all the equipment that it would take to do that. But I think that if like 5 years from now, I would be surprised if you didn't see solar powered fast chargers starting to pop up, especially in like the southwest of the country, where you have a lot of room and it's a really, really good candidate for solar power. So that's just my kind of speculation, but that's there are a few out there, but they're not super common yet.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Cool. No problem. Hey, Chris.
Hi.
Hey.
Blake, thanks very much for this great presentation. A couple of months ago, I made my reservation for the Tesla Cybertruck, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that particular vehicle and how it relates to what you had talked about tonight.
I think it's awesome, bluntly. I think it's hard to. I have the same concerns about this. I don't have any concerns about a Cybertruck that I don't have about any vehicle in its first model year. Like when the Model Y launched, there were a couple of initial challenges like panel gaps and paint quality issues. I think one thing about Tesla that I always tell people, and I drive a Tesla myself, and I'm definitely an enthusiast, is they're more like a software company in many ways than a car company, and they have a certain openness to like ship it and fix it later. Like it's part of their strategy to get cars out and then have you come back if you have an issue. So I think as long I'll say this of my car, I've spent more time at the service center for my car than I perhaps would have liked. I think as long as you have an openness to a little bit of early adopter pain with the Cybertruck, you're going to be in good shape and you're going to be happy. So that's my 2 cents.
Thanks. I really appreciate that. I've had a Kia Optima hybrid now since 2014, and it's had some challenges in terms of mechanicals, but overall I love it. I mean, it's a workhorse, and it's not a plug-in hybrid, but I get 450 to 500 miles a tank.
That's awesome.
And it's just amazing. Now the roads in New Jersey, I have to say, are kind of bumpy. So having either the Lightning and the Ford or the Cybertruck, I think it would work really well for my lifestyle and how much I drive. I drive quite a lot. I have almost 160,000 miles in my car. So, I took 2 years to research it and get it. But now that Tesla's like really got the whole platform and everything kind of built, it seems pretty easy to just adopt and do it. It's like a no-brainer, like you said.
Yeah, they're picking up a full head of steam right now. I'm definitely impressed. Very cool.
Thank you.
All right, Sarah.
Hey, I have one comment in response to Morgan's question. I know that the city of New York has, they had like 50, maybe they're probably up to like way more than that now, solar EV chargers. They're like canopies and the car charges under them. That's for their own fleet because they're converting to electric. But there's information about that online. They're pretty cool looking. And maybe they have information about their efficiency and how they've maybe evolved in the last couple of years. But I was also wondering, and this feels like a silly question, a silly concern, but I guess it comes down to the same like range anxiety. If you were to run out of charge on the side of the road, and you call your AAA or you call your insurance company, do they have mobile charging, Or is it like they tow you to a charger?
Yeah, so the short answer is both. And the thing you'll get depends. So around here, there are a couple of I don't think AAA has these yet, but there's a company, it's called like Spark Charge or something. I can't remember what they're called, but they're selling these power bricks that are starting to be popularized certain places in California. I'm sure it'll happen here soon, which is basically like 10 miles of range, like in a brick. And they'll show up, and then you'll sit there on the side of the road and get your 10 miles of range, and it'll take a while, which is just a frustration that you have to be prepared for. Which is why I actually think that like getting thrown on the flatbed and getting towed somewhere is probably actually better, because sitting on the side of the road waiting to get 10 miles to drive somewhere to try to charge the rest of the way, like, I don't know, I'm not particularly excited about that. So that's kind of what you're looking at right now. In the future, 5 years from now, I would predict that there will be charging vehicles that will have high voltage charging capability and could get you 50 miles in 15 minutes, and then you're just off on your merry way. We're not there yet, but it's clearly coming. So yeah, that's what I would foresee.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Very cool. Hey, Nancy, do you have a question?
Yeah, hi. So I'm Nancy Blackwood. I'm down the road from you guys in Red Bank. And I had a question. Have you or the EC and Atlantic Highlands started talking with your municipality about electrifying their fleet of vehicles?
Yeah, so great question. And Sarah actually had Sarah raised what the city was doing, and I actually had a conversation with somebody from the mayor's sustainability office a couple of weeks ago, and she told me all about the plans to electrify the fleet there. And I was so impressed because they actually have a sanitation truck now that's electric only, which is just so awesome. I'm not trying to dodge your question, Nancy, but based on that conversation, I started to have a little bit of a sideboard conversation with our borough administrator about whether that could be an option at some point in the future. And I think that hopefully over time could bear fruit. I mean, right now, nothing kind of imminent or exciting to announce there. I will say that in the short term that we are actively trying to figure out how to get an EV charger or set of chargers in town. That's a project that we're actively working on as an environmental commission. And the other thing that I'm going to be bringing up during next week's meeting is around what's called a EV charger approved accessory ordinance, which makes it so that it's really a streamlined process to get your own EV, your own charging system at home. Right. So anyway, that's at the risk of having danced around your question a little bit, nothing imminent in terms of electrifying the fleet. I did get an offer from the sustainability office because she said something to me that was funny, that should have been obvious. She's like, if you go and tell somebody in your municipal, like DPW or whatever, that they should get EVs, they're not going to listen to you because like you don't do their job, and they're going to perceive you as not having any idea what the hell you're talking about. But if you have somebody from, say, the New York City operations team that actually is overseeing these vehicles every day, talk to your own operations people, they might be able to persuade them, whereas you as a kind of a pencil pusher might not. So I'm hoping to facilitate one of those conversations at some point in the future, but we're taking baby steps right now.
Oh, okay, that sounds great. I appreciate that.
Very cool. Thanks so much, Nancy. Great to meet you.
Same here.
Hi, it's Councilwoman Hohenleitner. Nancy, it's so great that you joined the call today. And there's a lot of members of our Environmental Commission, and I know our green team, there's been members on the call. So it's great. I think, we've talked before about joining municipality to municipality and sharing ideas. So I really welcome us moving forward, having some calls with other municipalities to talk about how we can implement some of these things and potentially write grants together. So it's great to have you here.
Well, thank you. And I think it's great. We do need to all coalesce together I think that's how we're going to make a lot of changes that we need in this area.
Very cool. All right, y'all. Well, thank you so much for making the time, and I hope this was helpful. I hope some of you, if you were thinking about maybe taking the plunge with an EV, you're a little bit closer now. I put my email in there. It's ahec.bdeacon@gmail.com. If you have any questions, if you want the slideware, anything you want, feel free to reach out, and have a lovely evening.